Chapter 20. Driving SPM Production Effectively. Driving specialized pro-resolving mediator production effectively does not mean forcing the body to manufacture more of one isolated molecule. It means rebuilding the conditions under which the body can actually convert inflammation into completion. That distinction matters because SPM biology sits at the end of a long chain. EPA and DHA must be absorbed, protected from oxidation, incorporated into membrane phospholipids, stored in the right tissues, released under the right conditions, routed through the right enzymatic pathways, and then received by a tissue environment capable of acting on late-phase instruction. If any part of that chain is weak, SPM production remains underpowered no matter how enthusiastically omega-3 is consumed. The real task is therefore not simply increasing intake. It is strengthening the structural, enzymatic, oxidative, and inflammatory context that allows intake to become resolution. The first requirement is adequate precursor supply in a form the body can actually use. SPMs are derived primarily from EPA and DHA, so the membrane reservoir has to contain enough of both to make later conversion meaningful. That means the question is never just whether omega-3 is present in the diet at all. The question is whether enough intact EPA and DHA are reaching tissues to alter phospholipid composition in a durable way. Low intake fails because it never meaningfully changes the reservoir. Poor bioavailability fails because the body never receives enough usable substrate to remodel membranes. Oxidized inputs fail because damaged fats do not build clean precursor pools. Driving SPM production, therefore, begins with delivering intact omega-3 substrate in a way that the body can digest, absorb, transport, and preserve. The second requirement is membrane remodeling. SPM production cannot be driven from circulation alone. The body resolves from what it has built into tissue. EPA and DHA must displace part of the existing phospholipid environment, especially in tissues that have been chronically dominated by omega-6 heavy substrate. This takes time, repeated incorporation, and enough consistency that the membrane reservoir actually changes. Until that happens, the releasable pool during inflammation remains biased toward arachidonic acid-heavy initiation chemistry. This is why most supplementation disappoints. People try to generate a downstream resolution response from a membrane reservoir that still mostly belongs to the front half of inflammation. Effective SPM production begins when the body is no longer trying to finish inflammation with membranes still built for escalation. The third requirement is reducing omega-6 pathway dominance. This does not mean eliminating omega-6 because the body still requires initiation chemistry. It means reducing chronic overrepresentation. If linoleic acid-heavy intake remains excessive and membrane pools remain crowded by arachidonic acid-rich substrate, then shared enzymatic systems remain tilted toward early-phase eicosanoid production. EPA and DHA may be present, but they will still have too little room in the membrane and too little pathway influence once phospholipids and COX/LOX activity begin. Driving SPM production effectively, therefore, requires not only adding precursor, but reducing the degree to which the tissue remains preloaded for early-phase inflammatory output. Otherwise, the chemistry of initiation keeps drowning out the chemistry of completion. The fourth requirement is oxidative protection. EPA and DHA are useful because they are highly unsaturated, but that same property makes them chemically fragile. A body under chronic oxidative stress will not preserve omega-3, derived precursor pools well enough to build strong SPM biology. Membranes become damaged. Peroxidation products accumulate. Reactive lipid fragments continue acting as danger signals. The tissue then loses precursor integrity before it can gain pro-resolving strength. This means that effective SPM production depends on lowering the oxidative burden surrounding highly unsaturated fatty acids. The body has to stop chewing through the very material it is trying to use for resolution. That requires a less inflammatory diet overall, better metabolic stability, better sleep, lower chronic toxic load, better barrier control, and enough antioxidant support at the tissue level that EPA and DHA remain usable instead of becoming collateral damage. The fifth requirement is enzymatic availability and phase transition. EPA and DHA do not become resolvins, protectins, and maresins automatically. They must be routed through the appropriate enzymatic pathways at the appropriate time. That means the tissue must shift out of front-half inflammatory dominance and into mediator class switching. If neutrophil-heavy recruitment, cytokine escalation, and arachidonic acid-driven traffic remain dominant, then COX and LOX pathways continue serving initiation logic. The person may have improved omega-3 status and still produce weak SPM output because the site never transitions into the phase where SPM generation is supposed to matter. Effective SPM production therefore depends on reducing repeated re-triggering and allowing inflammatory events to proceed far enough into closure biology that the later mediator environment can actually take command. The sixth requirement is macrophage competence. SPMs matter because they change what macrophages do, but macrophages also matter because if they are metabolically strained, overwhelmed by debris, or trapped in mixed inflammatory phenotypes, then even good pro-resolving signaling will have weaker effects. A tissue full of uncleared apoptotic cells, oxidized lipid debris, and repeated immune residue becomes hard to finish. Driving SPM production effectively, therefore, also means lowering the cleanup burden enough that macrophages can succeed. Less incoming inflammatory traffic, better barrier control, lower oxidative injury, and stronger precursor supply all converge on one practical outcome: the site becomes more cleanable. That matters because SPMs are not magic molecules that erase debris. They are instructions for cells that still have to do the work. The seventh requirement is adequate energy availability. Resolution is labor. Efferocytosis costs ADP. Membrane repair costs ADP. Restoring endothelial and epithelial control costs ADP. Mitochondrial strain is therefore one of the major hidden blocks to SPM effectiveness. A tissue can receive pro-resolving instructions and still fail to complete inflammation if it lacks the energetic organization required to carry those instructions out. This is why driving SPM production effectively is not only a lipid problem, it is also a mitochondrial problem. The body has to have enough organized energy to fund the cleanup, barrier restoration, and structural rebuilding that SPMs are trying to direct. Otherwise, the chemistry of completion appears without the labor of completion following it strongly enough. The eighth requirement is reducing chronic re-triggering. This may be the most practically important point of all. SPM biology cannot dominate in a tissue that keeps being shoved back into early-phase inflammatory logic every day. Barrier leakage, endotoxin burden, ultra-processed food exposure, mechanical overload, sleep disruption, repeated glycemic volatility, ongoing infections, poor oral health, toxic exposures, and unresolved inflammatory debris all keep the body re-entering initiation before resolution can finish. In that setting, even excellent omega-3 delivery and strong membrane remodeling may underperform. The tissue is constantly being told to start over. Driving SPM production effectively, therefore, means building enough physiological quiet that the body can actually stay in the later phase long enough for pro-resolving chemistry to matter. This also means strategy should be goal-driven. If the dominant problem is persistent inflammatory traffic, vascular reactivity, or repeated cardiometabolic escalation, then EPA often deserves greater emphasis because it more directly changes substrate competition and supports E-series resolve and output. If the dominant problem is neurofragility, tissue preservation, chronic pain sensitization, poor cleanup, or membrane instability in high-precision tissue, then DHA deserves greater emphasis because it supports structural function while also feeding D-series resolvins, protectins, and marazins. If the dominant problem is broad resolution failure across multiple tissues, then both matter because the body needs less continued recruitment, better preservation, and stronger cleanup at the same time. Effective SPM production is strongest when intake design matches the failure pattern. Seen clearly, driving SPM production effectively is not a supplement trick, it is a reconstruction project. The body must be given enough intact EPA and DHA, enough membrane remodeling time, less omega-6 crowding, less oxidative damage, less re-triggering, better macrophage cleanup conditions, and enough mitochondrial support that late-phase mediator biology can actually be expressed. Once those conditions are in place, SPM production stops looking mysterious. The body begins doing what it was built to do all along: stop recruiting when enough recruitment has occurred, clear what inflammation produced, protect tissue during the transition, and return the site to a state that no longer behaves like unfinished danger. Dose thresholds for conversion. Dose thresholds for conversion matter because omega-3 biology does not operate in a simple straight line where any increase in intake produces a proportionate increase in specialized pro-resolving mediator output. The body has to cross from symbolic exposure into functional substrate sufficiency. Below that threshold, EPA and DHA may be present in the diet or even measurable in circulation, yet still remain too weakly incorporated into phospholipid pools to materially change the releasable membrane reservoir. In that state, inflammation still draws mainly from the substrate environment it already knows, which is often dominated by omega-6 derived initiation chemistry. The person is technically taking omega-3, but the body has not yet reached the point where that intake changes the downstream probability of resolvin, protectin, or mycin production in a meaningful way. The threshold is therefore not just about amount swallowed. It is about the amount required to shift membrane composition far enough that later phase signaling begins to notice. This is why low or inconsistent dosing so often produces disappointment. Small amounts may be enough to create the impression of action in the bloodstream, while doing very little to remodel the tissues that actually govern inflammatory behavior. Membranes turn over slowly relative to the expectations people usually bring to supplementation. If the phospholipid pool remains overwhelmingly weighted toward omega-6 derived substrate, then a low dose of EPA or DHA may never cross the level needed to alter the competitive balance of what is released during inflammatory activation. The body continues to generate the front half of inflammation from the same reservoir it had before, and the later phase omega-3 derived pathways remain too weak to take command. What looks like omega-3 failure is often threshold failure. The intake never became large or consistent enough to change the store material from which future inflammatory events will be built. The threshold is also nonlinear because once membrane incorporation rises past a certain point, downstream consequences can become more noticeable relatively quickly. This is one reason some people report little change for a period of time, and then a more distinct shift later. The biology is not necessarily gradual in a smooth, visible way. First, the membrane reservoir changes quietly. Then substrate competition begins shifting. Then, when the next inflammatory event occurs, the tissue may produce a different mediator profile because enough EPA or DHA has entered the releasable pool to matter. That delayed transition is exactly what a threshold process looks like. The body does not reward every tiny increase equally. It often stays functionally similar until the structural balance changes enough to create a different inflammatory outcome. EPA and DHA may also have different effective thresholds depending on the goal. If the objective is to alter inflammatory traffic more directly and affect eicosanoid competition, the relevant EPA threshold is the point at which EPA is incorporated strongly enough to influence the inflammatory mediator landscape rather than remaining a minor membrane presence. If the objective is neuroprotection, synaptic stability, or greater access to DHA-derived mediators such as protectins and mycins, then the meaningful threshold is the point at which DHA becomes sufficiently represented in specialized membrane pools to alter both structure and downstream resolution potential. These are not identical biological targets, which is why dose thresholds cannot be treated as one universal number in a mechanistic discussion. The important point is that each branch of omega-3 biology requires more than trace presence. It requires enough precursor density in tissue to build functional rather than symbolic potential. Oxidative state, omega-6 burden, gut absorption, and inflammatory background all change where the threshold effectively sits. A person with poor bioavailability may require far more intake to achieve the same membrane remodeling another person gets with less. A person living under chronic oxidative stress may appear to reach intake targets while still failing to preserve enough clean EPA or DHA in membranes for strong downstream conversion. A person whose tissues remain heavily loaded with omega-6 derived substrate may need a larger and more consistent omega-3 input over a longer window before substrate competition begins shifting meaningfully. In that sense, the threshold is biological, not just arithmetic. It reflects what the tissue needs in order to cross from low influence to real influence inside a living inflammatory environment. Seen clearly, dose thresholds for conversion are the point at which omega-3 stops being merely consumed and starts becoming functionally available for SPM biology. Below that threshold, the body may still be underbuilt for completion even while supplementation is technically present. Above it, the membrane reservoir begins to change enough that downstream conversion into resolvins, protectins, and mycins becomes more plausible and more influential. The central lesson is that resolution biology does not respond well to token exposure. It responds when enough intact precursor has accumulated in the right membrane pools under conditions stable enough to let the body finally convert stored omega-3 into the chemistry of closure. Supporting enzymatic pathways. Supporting enzymatic pathways means supporting the body's ability to turn stored EPA and DHA into actual pro-resolving output rather than leaving them stranded as underused membrane substrate. This is a crucial distinction. A tissue may contain omega-3 and still fail to resolve well if the enzymes responsible for routing that omega-3 into later phase mediator families remain crowded, mistimed, oxidatively disrupted, or functionally overshadowed by the chemistry of ongoing initiation. Cyclooxygenase and lipoxygenase pathways are not passive assembly lines waiting to do resolution work whenever substrate appears. They are dynamic systems embedded inside living inflammatory states. They respond to phase, substrate abundance, membrane composition, oxidative pressure, and the broader condition of the tissue. Supporting these pathways, therefore, does not mean pushing one enzyme harder in isolation. It means building the conditions under which the body can actually shift enzymatic traffic from escalation-dominant chemistry toward completion-dominant chemistry. The first form of support is substrate clarity. Enzymes can only work with what they encounter, and if the releasable phospholipid pool remains heavily dominated by arachidonic acid-rich substrate, then COX and LOX traffic will remain biased toward early-phase eicosanoid production. Supporting the enzymatic pathways, therefore, begins by changing what reaches them. EPA and DHA have to be meaningfully incorporated into phospholipids so that when phospholipids mobilize fatty acids during inflammation, the enzymes are not seeing almost exclusively omega-6 derived initiation material. This is why membrane remodeling is not separate from enzyme support, is upstream of it. A pathway crowded with the wrong substrate cannot produce much of the right output, no matter how intact the enzymes themselves may be. The second form of support is reducing repeated inflammatory retriggering. Enzymes remain biased toward early-phase chemistry when the tissue never exits early-phase conditions. If neutrophil-heavy recruitment, endotoxin exposure, barrier leakage, oxidative injury, and cytokine escalation keep recurring, then the body keeps using COX and LOX systems for what it believes is still urgent work: initiation, amplification, and reinforcement. In that context, omega-3 derived conversion remains weak not because the enzymes are absent, but because the tissue never reaches a convincing enough late phase for pro-resolving routing to dominate. Supporting the pathway, therefore, means creating enough physiological quiet that mediator class switching can actually occur. The body has to stop being forced back into the first half of inflammation every time it tries to move into the second. The third form of support is oxidative protection. Highly unsaturated fatty acids are vulnerable, and the enzymes processing them are operating inside membranes and tissues that can become chemically disordered under high oxidative load. If EPA and DHA are being peroxidized, if membranes remain unstable, or if reactive lipid fragments keep accumulating, then the pathway loses clean substrate and clean context at the same time. Even when omega-3 is present, the conversion process becomes less efficient because the tissue is handling damaged lipids, damaged surfaces, and continued distress signaling rather than preserved resolution substrate. Supporting the enzymatic pathways, therefore, requires lowering the oxidative burden that would otherwise destroy precursor integrity before useful conversion can happen. The fourth form of support is metabolic support. Resolution is not only a signaling event, it is a labor phase. Once enzymes generate late-phase mediators, cells still have to respond. Macrophages must clear debris. Endothelial surfaces must normalize. Barriers must reclose. Membranes must be rebuilt. All of that costs energy. If mitochondrial function is poor, then even successful mediator generation may produce weak biological follow-through because the tissue cannot afford the work of completion. Supporting enzymatic pathways, therefore, also means supporting the metabolic competence of the cells that those pathways are trying to direct. A body underpowered for repair will underexpress the value of even properly generated pro-resolving signals. The fifth form of support is phase discipline. The body needs to maintain the distinction between initiation and resolution rather than remaining chemically smeared across both. Early inflammation requires force. Late inflammation requires closure. If that distinction is lost, the enzymatic landscape becomes confused. The tissue keeps producing some escalation signals, some attempted stop signals, and insufficient coherence in either direction. Supporting the pathways means helping the body move through the program in order. Enough initiation to contain the problem. Then enough class switching to prevent endless recruitment. Then enough cleanup and structural support to make the new mediator environment matter. Enzymes work best when the tissue's priorities are clear. Seen clearly, supporting enzymatic pathways means supporting substrate balance, lowering omega-6 crowding, reducing re-triggering, protecting PUFAs from oxidation, maintaining mitochondrial capacity, and allowing the inflammatory sequence to move far enough into its later phase that COX and LOX systems stop being trapped in perpetual initiation logic. The deeper point is that enzymes do not fail in isolation. They fail inside tissue environments that remain too structurally biased toward escalation. Change that environment, and the same pathways become more capable of producing the chemistry of completion instead of repeating the chemistry of defense. Reducing omega-6 competition. Reducing omega-6 competition is one of the most practical ways to strengthen resolution biology because EPA and DHA do not enter an empty membrane or an empty enzyme system. They enter a body already carrying a stored phospholipid history. If that history is dominated by linoleic acid-heavy intake and arachidonic acid-rich downstream substrate, then the membrane reservoir, the releasable fatty acid pool, and the shared COX and LOX pathways are all biased toward the chemistry of initiation. In that setting, adding omega-3 helps, but it often helps too weakly because the body is still structurally organized around escalation. Reducing omega-6 competition means lowering the degree to which early-phase substrate controls the membrane and the downstream mediator environment. It is not about eliminating omega-6 completely. It is about reducing chronic overrepresentation so that omega-3-derived completion pathways can gain real biochemical influence. The first place this matters is the membrane itself. Phospholipids can only hold so much fatty acid substrate. If omega-6-derived material dominates those positions, then when phospholipids are activated during inflammation, the body mainly releases substrate for arachidonic acid-heavy eicosanoid production. Even meaningful omega-3 intake may produce only modest downstream effects if the membrane reservoir remains crowded by omega-6. Reducing omega-6 competition therefore begins with changing what is repeatedly built into tissue over time. The goal is not to abolish initiation chemistry. The goal is to stop letting initiation chemistry monopolize the reservoir from which future inflammatory behavior will be drawn. The second place it matters is shared enzymatic traffic. EPA and DHA compete with omega-6-derived substrate for elongase, desaturase, cyclooxygenase, and lipoxygenase handling. If omega-6 remains chronically excessive, those pathways stay crowded by the work of initiation. The tissue keeps generating prostaglandin, leukotriene, thromboxane, and related early-phase outputs because that is the substrate landscape most strongly presented to the enzymes. Reducing omega-6 competition gives EPA and DHA more room to matter within the same systems. It does not create new enzymes. It changes what those enzymes are most likely to encounter and convert. This is one reason reducing omega-6 competition often matters as much as increasing omega-3 intake. A person can add omega-3 while still maintaining a membrane environment so heavily skewed toward omega-6 that the new substrate never gains enough influence to shift inflammatory direction meaningfully. In that case, the body remains good at escalation and only slightly less poor at completion. But when omega-6 pressure falls at the same time omega-3 intake rises, the membrane can remodel more effectively, substrate competition becomes less lopsided, and the later phase chemistry of resolvins, protectins, and marazins has a better chance of becoming biologically relevant rather than remaining theoretically possible. Reducing competition also helps with threshold behavior. A tissue loaded with omega-6-derived inflammatory potential becomes easier to push into early phase signaling. Less provocation is needed to release substrate, activate eicosanoid cascades, alter vascular tone, and recruit immune traffic. When omega-6 dominance is reduced, the tissue is less preloaded for automatic escalation. That does not make it defenseless. It makes it less hair-triggered. This matters because a body that starts slightly less easily is often a body that can finish more successfully, especially if omega-3-derived resolution substrate is simultaneously being rebuilt. Seen clearly, reducing omega-6 competition is not a moral campaign against one fat family. It is a structural strategy for reopening biochemical space. It makes membrane incorporation of EPA and DHA more meaningful, makes shared enzyme pathways less crowded by initiation-heavy traffic, lowers the tissue's bias toward repeated escalation, and improves the odds that later-phase mediator biology can actually take command when inflammation should begin resolving. The body still needs omega-6. It just cannot resolve well when omega-6 dominates the entire conversation. Time course of SPM upregulation. The time course of SPM upregulation is slower and more layered than most people expect because the body does not move from omega-3 intake to full resolution output in one step. Specialized pro-resolving mediators sit downstream of several structural and biochemical events that must occur in order. First, EPA and DHA have to be digested, absorbed, and transported. Then they have to be incorporated into phospholipid membranes in meaningful amounts. Then those remodeled membranes have to become part of the tissue's releasable substrate pool. Then, when an inflammatory event occurs, the tissue has to reach the phase where phospholipids, COX and LOX pathways, and mediator class switching begin routing those substrates toward resolvins, protectins, and marazins rather than leaving the chemistry dominated by arachidonic acid-heavy initiation. Only after those steps does SPM output begin to matter functionally. That means upregulation is not immediate. It unfolds across different biological clocks at once. The first clock is absorption and circulating availability, which is relatively fast. EPA and DHA can appear in blood and transport pools within hours to days depending on dose, form, meal context, and digestive function. But this early phase is often misleading because circulation is not the same thing as resolution capacity. A person may achieve measurable exposure quickly while experiencing almost no real change in inflammatory sequencing because the membrane reservoir has not yet remodeled enough to alter what tissues will actually release and convert later. This is one reason people often overestimate short-term omega-3 effects. The body has seen the precursor, but has not yet become built from the precursor strongly enough to behave differently under stress. The second clock is membrane incorporation, and this is the more decisive one. Phospholipid remodeling takes longer because tissues do not replace their fatty acid composition instantly. Some tissues turn over more quickly, some more slowly, and different compartments within the same tissue remodel at different rates. Over days to weeks, and more meaningfully over weeks to months, repeated EPA and DHA input can begin shifting the phospholipid environment enough that the releasable substrate pool changes. This is the stage where future inflammatory behavior starts being rewritten in advance. The membrane is becoming less exclusively prepared for omega-6 heavy escalation and more capable of supporting omega-3 derived completion chemistry. Upregulation of SPM potential therefore begins before actual SPM production rises dramatically. The reservoir changes first. The third clock is inflammatory phase opportunity. Even after membranes have begun to remodel, SPM biology is not constantly maximized. These mediators belong to the later phase of inflammation. That means the tissue has to actually enter an inflammatory event and also move far enough through that event that the body begins shifting from recruitment and amplification into cleanup and closure. If the tissue is constantly being re-triggered, if the site remains too dominated by early cytokine and eicosanoid logic, or if barrier dysfunction and oxidative stress keep forcing the body back into the front half of inflammation, then the full expression of SPM upregulation may lag behind membrane remodeling. The precursor is present, but the tissue has not crossed into the phase where that precursor can be converted and used strongly enough to matter. This is why people can improve their omega-3 status and still feel stuck for a time. The chemistry of completion is available in principle before it is fully expressed in practice. The fourth clock is cleanup burden. A tissue carrying heavy inflammatory residue, uncleared apoptotic cells, oxidized lipid fragments, macrophage inefficiency, and persistent endothelial or barrier dysfunction often needs time before improved SPM biology can produce visible functional change. Even if pro-resolving mediator output begins to rise, the tissue still has to process the damage history that was already present. Resolution is labor. Less new recruitment is only one part of it. Existing debris must still be removed. Pain amplification must still be withdrawn. Membranes must still be repaired. Barriers must still reclose. The result is that SPM upregulation may occur before symptom relief looks dramatic because the body is first using the improved resolution environment to finish old work rather than immediately producing a clean feeling of relief. This is why the time course is usually nonlinear. Early on, there may be little noticeable change while absorption and initial membrane incorporation are occurring. Then, once membrane composition crosses a more meaningful threshold and the tissue enters conditions where mediator class switching can happen more effectively, the system may begin changing more noticeably. After that, if repeated re-triggering remains lower and cleanup burden starts falling, the body may show a broader rise in resilience rather than just a drop in one symptom. Thresholds increase. Minor triggers create less escalation. Recovery after stress improves. Pain or reactivity becomes less sticky. That later shift can seem sudden from the outside, but it is usually the visible consequence of slower, invisible remodeling that happened beforehand. The most important point is that SPM upregulation follows structural time more than supplement time. It depends on how fast tissues can remodel, how strongly omega-6 competition is reduced, how well oxidative damage is controlled, how effectively barriers are restored, and whether the body can actually enter the later phase of inflammation without being pushed back into repeated initiation. The clock therefore differs from person to person and tissue to tissue. A relatively stable body with decent digestion, lower inflammatory load, and moderate omega-6 competition may show meaningful changes earlier. A body in a true stuck inflammation state may require much longer because the organism is not simply waiting for more precursor. It is trying to rebuild the entire context in which precursor can become resolution. Seen clearly, the time course of SPM upregulation runs in layers. Rapid exposure, slower membrane incorporation, later nonlinear, increases in conversion potential, and then still later improvements in cleanup, thresholds, and tissue behavior. That is why omega-3 should not be judged by whether it produces an immediate suppressive effect. Its deepest value appears when enough time has passed for the body to stop merely containing the substrate and start using it to change the inflammatory ending.